Hey woodworkers. So talking about cutting joinery and cutting specifically tenons, um, we need to start talking about what type of saw we want to use. And there's a couple of choices really. The only two that I think we should focus on that really matter are if this is a Western style saw that cuts as you push the saw away from yourself, or a Japanese style saw which cuts on the pull stroke or as you pull towards yourself. There's nothing wrong with either one of these things. I think that most beginning woodworkers gravitate a little bit more to the Japanese style. They're a thinner plate or body of the blade. And the way that the mechanics work on this thing, I think you use some of your larger muscle groups to pull through this tool, and they're great. I have found for optics, for the ability to see what it is I'm cutting, I prefer a Western style saw. And I've used Japanese saws for years and years and years, and then I started to get thrown off a little bit when I was cutting really accurate joinery because I wanted to see a little bit more of what I was cutting, which will make sense here shortly. But so that's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you how to cut both styles. But those are the conversations to think about. I would encourage you to try them both out. A decent Japanese saw, we're talking about 30 to 50 bucks maybe. You can definitely spend way more than that on getting a beautiful saw. Most of the time Japanese saws have a removable blade so that when the saw dulls, you just take this thing out. Yes, you take this thing out and then just buy another one to replace it. It'd be really cool if I could do that for today, just so you know I'm not lying. Well, you'll have to take my word on it. So, on the higher scale Japanese saws, these are sharpenable blades, which is good, but also very problematic to find a good sharpener of Japanese saws. They exist, they're just hard to find. Western saws, typically you don't have the luxury of replacing this blade, which is good. You'll have to send this out to a sharpener or learn how to sharpen them yourself. It's not terribly complicated, it's just time consuming as with most of woodworking. So what I've done on this board is I've mounted this material, which I propose to cut, into a vise. I need something to hold the work into position while I'm doing the business of cutting. And the other thing that I've done, so I'm hoping you can see, is I've drawn a series of lines on the face and on the end here to give me a reference of where it is that I want to saw. So this is a good way of getting into the practice and the habits of sawing, is to know exactly what it is you're cutting and more importantly where. It's really easy to cut inaccurately, but if you don't track where it is you're cutting or the habits you're picking up, then you won't know what to correct for or how to deal with it. So this is a practice that I get into if I haven't sawn for a while. It's easy enough to knock out a couple of these on a scrap board, ideally of the same material as whatever your project is, and go from there. So, okay. So when sawing, there are some mechanics to think about. I know you can't see this because I'm off camera, but I want to open up my hips a little bit more to give a little bit of more strength in my stance. If I were to stand both toes pointing towards what I'm cutting, I start to lose a lot of power here, and that saw can sometimes grab and start to dictate the motion and the power of my body into that cut. So open up your stance a little bit. Usually I stand with my back foot a little bit more at an angle to the face of this board, and then my front foot is a little bit closer to being in line. Not totally in line, but that gives me good drive or thrust into what it is that I'm sawing. The other thing that I'm thinking about, or you should be thinking about, is how I'm going to be functioning with the saw blade moving back and forth. You'll notice that my hand position here is in such a way that I'm kind of using my pointer finger to extend a little bit more of the grip. Most saws are made and designed in such a way that it's very uncomfortable for all four of your fingers to slip into this handle area, and sometimes people let their pinky finger kind of hang down, but there's a lot of power that you lose in doing that. So instead, the 3 lower fingers go into the handle, that pointer finger is here, and you can control so much more of what it is you're sawing in this method. Okay, so that's hand position. Thinking about the pivot points of our body, elbow is going to be the biggest pivoting point here, and that allows this thing to go back and forth. But all the power is going to start coming from the bigger muscle groups. Your shoulder functions as a pivot point, but it also drives into this cut. So just being aware of that will start to make us think about where I'm standing and how tall I want to tee up this board. If I have this too tall, there's 2 things that are going to happen. Number one, it's not supported right where the trauma is happening to this board, and so depending on the thickness of the board, it can start to bend or flex, which is going to throw off your rhythm and your power and ultimately the control of what it is you're cutting. So, and the other thing is that I now start to compromise a little bit of that straight pivot position here. So if it's too tall, I now have to compromise, and that usually means that I have a shorter stroke, and it also means that my wrist is in this awkward angle. So I want to drop this down to a lower position, and something at or below my elbow gets me right in line with where I want to be. Counterpoint to this, or the other conversation would be, depending on the height of your bench, if this was a really low bench and I were teeing this things up, or if I had this too low, then I'm going to be bending over a little bit at the hips, and that starts to get really uncomfortable on your lower back, especially if you're doing this for a long period of time. But this feels like a good height for what it is I'm doing. When I start to saw, I want to think about using the entire blade as much as I can. So I want to start at the outer tip of this blade and start driving through. The old adage is that you've paid for the whole blade, you might as well use it. It's very true. A lot of times when I see new woodworkers start cutting, they start cutting here much closer to where their hand is holding, and that's okay, but they overcompensate in the grip, and so they start over tightening and over gripping here, and that translates directly down. And so these teeth that are coming off of the blades no longer have the ability to cut laterally. They're trying to force this down to start chopping, and they start trying to pull the saw back and forth. It's a really tricky thing to do well, because once those teeth are engaged, you can't clear chips as easily than if you were to start of a place of less power and then start driving it through closer to your hand, pulling it back and starting or restarting the cut. Yeah, so keep that in mind. When I'm sighting down these lines, I want to make sure that my saw is at the right angle, and I'm going to switch positions and show you what that looks like here in a better shot. But for right now, starting further away from the tip of this blade, or from my hand, closer to the tip, the other thing that I do is I don't tend to cut along the end of the grain of the board all at once. I feel like when you're cutting, sometimes it has a tendency of bouncing around a little bit more than I want to. So I'm looking at the lines on the top, looking at the lines of the face, and in doing this, I can start to get a position that allows me to start cutting through, and then I pull back here, cutting through. Oops, not that far. So that's the cut. The other thing that I see a lot of people do is they start very close to their hands, but then they start pulling back here, and they start to create a curve into the wood. And I think everybody has started that habit. It's a good thing to never do again. You'll hear the difference when you pull on a Western style saw. It doesn't sound quite right. It sounds like you're fighting the saw, or more specifically, the saw is fighting you. But if I'm cutting in the right direction, pushing away from myself, it makes much more of a higher tune, kind of a sweet sound for the effects of cutting. So always make sure it's a not pull on a push saw, and that will keep you into good standing. Then my body position, based on how close or how far away I am. I want to be able to use my non-sawing hand for a couple things. So I'll typically use the tip of my knuckle here as a pivot if I need to readjust, or the tip of my thumb depending on what it is I'm cutting. But if I have my hand here in position, and I'll switch hands to show a little bit better. If I have my now non-dominant hand in position here, I can start to guide this position here and use it as a fulcrum of some kind. And then cutting through, it's still not a bad idea to leave that hand in position. This is very awkward for me. This may represent the only time I've ever cut left-handed. For good reason. Once you're into the cut, this hand is no longer doing any good. So that's where it goes. Okay. The Japanese saw is a little bit different now. So Japanese saws, as I said, cut a little bit simpler here on the pull stroke. You kind of hear the difference in tune. I think the Western saw is a bit more aggressive. I have far more teeth on this saw, and so it's going to take me a little bit longer to cut. But in doing this, I was starting off having all the teeth engaged at the end of the board here, and I know a lot of woodworkers do that. The reason that I switched from Japanese saws to Western saws is that I wanted to start the cut on the outside edge over here, this corner, because at that point I can sight down the top of my layout line, and then I can kind of reference where the face is, but that's a long ways away from where the saw is actually cutting. And so with a Western style, I'm able to start on a corner here, and the blade is already engaged in both that top line and that face line. So because I can't really start a good cut in the same manner on a pole saw, this way I start to get into some problems where if those fibers are sticking up here and then I'm pulling away, this starts to give me a lot more tear out, and then as it meets another grain of the board, this starts to pull out as well. Whereas if I go on the opposite corner here, that grain is supported. So if I'm cutting what is represented here in my pointer finger, that grain is going to be supported by every other piece of grain behind it. And so in doing that, I just feel like this gives me a much cleaner cut in going through it. Okay, so those are the big differences here. Again, there's nothing wrong with either one of these things. They're both great, and I use this one all the time still, even though I prefer for the accurate work, the detail stuff to be the Western saw. All of the saws that I've shown you thus far have a back on them, and I wanted to saw down with this one to show you that there's going to be a limit to the depth of the cut that you can make with a saw that has a back on it. And this one I think I can go a little bit deeper. Yeah, I can go deeper on this Western style. Some saws don't have as much of that plate to cut with. There are some Japanese saws that have a combination of cross-cut teeth and ripping teeth. And with these, there's no back on them. And so this one will be able to, in theory, just cut all the way through the board if you choose to or if you need to. The way that Japanese saws are able to get away from not having a back is that the blade is tensioned. I'm going to rip. The blade is tensioned as we pull away, and so that creates that rigidity inside of the plate of the blade. If a Western saw did not have this back on it, once you start cutting through here, there's nothing to give this any rigidity, and it would just start to fold or crumble like a pretzel or a chip or whatever. Those are kind of the differences. Ripping, cross-cutting, all of these saws have a different purpose. Chris Schwartz has this great saying that you can use all of these saws to do any type of cut. If you're using a rip saw to cross cut or vice versa, they will definitely do it. It's just going to take you longer to do what you need to. Thanks.